Hello and good evening. Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. It is a particularly warm and sticky evening here in the UK. Please feel free to pop in the chat who you are and where you're joining from while the last few people sort of join us this evening. So I'm Ellie Duffy and I'm the operations manager here at Vet Sustain, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar tonight. We have a really brilliant topic ahead of us covering conversations with clients about sustainable pet ownership. To introduce you to Vet Sustain, if you don't know us, we're a not-for-profit community interest company, and our mission is centred around enabling and inspiring veterinary professionals to continually improve the health and well-being of animals, people, and the environment. We aim to help unite and support action across the professions to address the multitude of global crises that we are facing, with actions centred around our 6 veterinary sustainability goals. And if you aren't familiar with our veterinary sustainability goals, I recommend that you go and check those out on the Sustain website. I'm absolutely delighted that Animal Care are sponsoring our webinar tonight, and Colin Kapner, who's Senior Veterinary Manager for Animal Care, is with us this evening, and he'll share a little bit later on about some of the initiatives that they're involved with as well. And I know through working with Animal Care that they are committed to leading in animal health through innovative and trusted products and services to support the profession, and that they're also committed to the well-being of animals and promoting the positive impact that healthy animals have. I know this is a topic that Animal Care are really passionate about, and I'm really delighted that you could join us this evening. So our speaker for this evening is the wonderful Justine Shotton. Justine has had many hats within her career, but is currently a Vet Sustain Director and Head Vet for Wildlife and Exotics at the RSPCA. She's also a BVA past president, and hot off the press this week, Justine has just been appointed an RCVS fellow for her contributions to the profession. So we are incredibly lucky to have her with us at Vet Sustain and joining us this evening. If you have any questions as we go through, please do feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll have time for questions and discussions a little bit later on. And without further ado, Justine, I'm going to pass over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ellie. And I'd just like to echo Ellie's thanks for you all to be here on such a hot, sweaty summer's beautiful evening outside. But it's something I'm really passionate about, and I'm really pleased that you're here and look forward to chatting through some of this with you tonight. So just a bit of an intro to me. So I'm delighted to be on the team of directors at Vet Sustain. There's a huge bunch of very committed vets and veterinary professionals involved. And this was sort of inspired partly through my time at BVA. So I was lucky enough to be president from 2021 to 2022, and they really embraced my theme of sustainability. And we did a lot of work in the profession on sustainability across species, and sustainability in the profession too. So I've been a vet now for 16 years. I did start out in mixed practice, so domestics, farm animal, equine and smallies. I've carried on sort of emergency work smallies throughout my career, and I was also a zoo vet for almost a decade in Hampshire. And as Ellie said, I'm now at RSPCA as their head wildlife and exotics vet, but also championing sustainability with RSPCA too. I'm also an AWF trustee as well, so big up Animal Welfare Foundation too. So as I've said, I'm really passionate about this subject. I think it's something that there's a lot of interest in the public. There's a lot of interest in the profession, and we're starting about talking about it more and more. And I think it will become more of a focus, particularly, with potentially more sustainability-minded pet owners in the future. And I think our profession and vets and vet nurses and the whole vet-led team are really uniquely placed to lead on this. I think we have a lot of work that we can do to embrace sustainable pet ownership, help educate clients, help them see things from their pet's perspective, not necessarily just our human perspective. And generally speaking, the things that are good for sustainability with pet ownership are also the best things for animal welfare and save clients money. So there's really no reason not to embrace it. And I think it's us who should be leading the way on this. So an overview of tonight. So we're going to talk about the aspects of what I like to call it the carbon paw print. And when we talk about the carbon paw print, we're not just talking about the carbon impacts. We'll come on to talk about wider impacts on things like biodiversity as well. But really think mainly from the owner's perspective and having those conversations with clients, but also what we can do in practice. And there's a lot to cover, and there are many other webinars, particularly on the vet practice perspective, that I'll link you up with, that have been run by Vet Sustain and others. So do check those out, because we can't possibly cover everything in one webinar. But we'll try and focus on the biggest impact actions and some easy wins and some good places to start with these conversations with clients. So your learning objectives, understand the main elements of the carbon paw print. Again, there are probably quite a few more that we can't include tonight. Understand some of the other biodiversity impacts, other impacts from things like plastics and even disease. We often don't think about that from our pets. Learn what advice to give clients to start thinking about minimizing their pets' carbon paw prints. And also talking a bit about practice health plans, because I think we've got a key opportunity of restructuring these to make things more accessible for clients, more individualized, still bond clients, still get a lot of practice income, and maybe move away from some of the models we're seeing now. So, oh, my slides are frozen. Okay, hang on. There's a slight lag. I think it's because my computer's also very hot tonight. So let me just make sure we have caught up. Bear with me. It's like a 5-second lag on my computer wanting to move the slides. Right, here we are. Sorry. So I think when we're talking about this subject, it's really important to think about the benefits and the importance of pet ownership. I think we all understand this as people working in the veterinary professions. We understand the bonds that we have with our pets, how they can reduce loneliness, provide companionship, increase our health, help us get outside in nature, improve our activity, even our mental health can be improved. And I think it's really important to reflect and recognize this. Pets are going to be here to stay. They're going to be part of our society. And so we need to embrace how we can make a life with them in a more sustainable way. A bit like other things in our life are going to be here to stay, like traveling, for example, but there's ways to do that in more sustainable ways. So we're definitely not saying that we shouldn't be embracing pet ownership. Also, pets can play other roles in society, which are really beneficial. You know, service dogs, guide dogs, emotional support animals, support animals in hospitals, which are often just pets that then go and play those sorts of roles. And we've also got working animals, such as, you know, the dogs that go and do these amazing jobs, mountain rescues and so forth. And some of them are pets too, and volunteers. So pets are amazing. And I think we really need to look at ways how we can embrace owning them in very sustainable ways. So what's the carbon paw print? So this is, if we strictly define it, it's the greenhouse gas contributions from all of the activities related to owning a pet. And this would include things like travel and transport, the food you feed your pet, medicines, anesthetics, veterinary type interventions, and also impacts from toys and gear. But for the context of this webinar, we're also going to be talking about wider impacts, so biodiversity impacts, things like wildlife predation or disturbance on dog walks, parasiticides. There's been a lot of talk in vet press around that, and impacts of things like pet poo. I didn't realise quite how detrimental that can be for the environment, let alone for things like disease spread, zoonoses and parasites too. I think we need to be mindful of diseases and what might happen in the future, especially with emerging diseases, what that might look like if it shows up in our pets, and also, you know, the stuff that we have for our pets, and plastics and all these fads and social media dressing up our pets and that kind of thing. So we'll cover all sorts of things related to that. So how big are these impacts? Well, they're pretty hard to quantify, and it does depend on the way that the impacts are calculated. So as with any sort of carbon calculation, it's a little bit hard to be completely accurate, but there's some good ways of starting to measure. And I think once you start measuring and look at things, you can then improve things as long as you're being consistent. So the key is to sort of think about what things are like now and how we can start reducing them. And they are likely to be significant. So depending on the stats that you look at around food, which is calculated for impacts in different ways, depending on the way that they calculate impacts of animal byproducts compared to other prime meats, for example. But overall, reasonable sources seem to think that the pet food emissions globally is comparable to the aviation industry globally, which is sort of mind-blowing considering how much we talk about trying to fly less and that sort of thing. But we don't really talk so much about feeding our pets in a more sustainable way necessarily. And we have a lot of pets. So in the UK, almost a third of households have a cat, almost a third of households have a dog, over a third. And that's sort of 13.5 million dogs and 12.5 million cats. And we're going to focus on dogs and cats for this webinar, not to say that other pets aren't really important and we need to consider their impacts too. But generally speaking, these sorts of pets, particularly the meat-eating pets, will have bigger impacts than maybe things like bunnies and guinea pigs. I think we also need to be mindful of things like exotic pets and impacts, for example, energy impacts that they might need for their health and welfare. So we mustn't forget those sorts of pets. But for this webinar, we'll focus on dogs and cats. So what are the impacts? So I'm going to break down tonight into these sort of following subheadings. So we'll start with pre-purchase decisions. And again, this is an area where the vet professions can get super involved. We'll talk a bit about the number of pets that people might be getting, the species, the sizes, and choosing healthy breeds. Preventative health is a huge part. Again, we can play and help that educational piece towards clients. And I think, again, this can really feed into things like green health plans and how we can really assess them to get good preventative health throughout the animal's life. Food and treats, so pet food for healthy pets is the biggest impact, element of the carbon pawprint, closely followed, well, not closely, but followed by poo and waste. So we'll talk about that too. And we'll touch on medicines and parasiticides and the issues around those. We'll talk about stuff and really trying to reframe things from the pet's perspective and how we can have those conversations with our clients too. And disease, as we mentioned, and biodiversity. And just briefly touch on practice impacts, but I'll point you into the direction of more resources and webinars on those. So starting off with pre-purchase decisions, we have a duty to help clients choose the right pets. And I know often we see them at a stage where it's almost too late, but I think we need to be really proactive here, get great practice messaging, reach out on social media, have good practice websites, individually post on social media, etc., to try and get some good information around what pet would fit with the right lifestyle for the owner. We need to talk about these extreme breeds, and I know there's been a lot of work already in the profession around brachycephalic animals in general, not just dogs, and also exotic pets and their specific welfare needs. But if we're starting out with healthier pets, they'll need less resource, less medicines, less anaesthetics, and so forth. We need to really be strong advocates for responsible breeding and health testing, and help clients understand that size and number of pets does have an impact related to the carbon pawprint. And I think BVA and others are starting to talk about less and better pet ownership, like we talk about less and better animal product consumption, for example, meat consumption. And are there ways that we can look after pets really well to maximize their welfare, but maybe own fewer of them, and with a caveat that obviously certain species do need companionships of animals of their own species. But I think it's also important to rethink, how do we interact with pets? There are many pets that have to stay inside all day because their owners can't take them for a walk, or indoor cats that don't get played with. You know, there's many shelters with animals that need walking or adopting, or at least fostering for a certain period of time. And can we have more of a shared model for pet ownership to help reduce those impacts, but still get a wider benefit in society from having that interaction with our animal friends? And advice on preventative health, which we'll come on to, and thinking again about the source of those animals. So again, you know, from an RSPCA perspective, since I've been working there, I've really seen how many animals need a good home, that are, you know, beautiful, amazing animals that are just sort of living out their days in a kennel environment. And so really rethinking where we source our pets from too is important. So preventative health, and we do a good job as vets and vet nurses, I think, on this, but I think there's much more that we can do. And this is a hugely important way to reduce our carbon paw prints for our clients' pets. If we have healthier animals, you know, the impacts, particularly of our veterinary work, will be massively reduced, and it's better welfare, and it will save the clients money. So again, focusing on this from the very beginning, it is critical. Prevention's always better, and we know that early intervention is also key in helping clients understand that coming to the vets early on if there's problems is likely to save them money and be better for their pets. It is a key message. And we talk a lot about vaccinations, we talk about parasite management, but maybe we don't talk quite so much about things like nutrition and long-term weight management. Also things like reproductive health, the pros and cons of neutering, the pros and cons of breeding. And if you are thinking of breeding, you know, what disease screening do you want to do? What fertility related interventions are necessary? If you've got a dog which is of a certain breed, you know, are there specific tests that you can do? I'm talking about things like brachycephalic respiratory function scoring before you suggest to that client it might be a sort of safer animal to breed from, because some of these breeds are going to be around for a long time, and if we can incrementally improve their health and welfare, that will still be a big win for the profession. We also should be talking more about things like dental health. You know, dental health in later life for dogs and cats is a massive issue. And we do sort of talk about toothbrushing in the puppy and kitten consults, but not very much. And I think emphasizing things like that and having the time, putting the resource into that, you know, using nurses more effectively can be brilliant for some of these challenging issues. So there's lots more that we can do. We can also talk about breed and age-related health screening as animals get older, or they go through different phases of their life, and age-appropriate exercise, you know, before things like osteoarthritis develop. So all of those sorts of things, I think we can bring more in to the initial contact with a client, whether that's when they're a young animal or they're just a new owner. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to struggle and grapple with as a profession for decades now really is obesity in our pet dogs and cats in this country and really globally. And we've been trying to move the dial on this using welfare examples for many years. And despite owners recognizing it, you know, their behaviors aren't changing often and the messages just aren't getting through. We know that these have a big impact on pet welfare, but it's also a massive sustainability impact. And it's a massive waste of those farm animals' lives, and that will have welfare impacts for the farm animals that go into the food too. So it's really hugely wasteful, and probably the quickest, easiest solution, if we can start to change the mindset around overfeeding, is the best way that we can make an impactful change on the carbon paw print almost overnight. So it's working on adding in sustainability as a sort of reason for people not to overfeed, maybe talking more about farm animal welfare for pet food, you know, it's not really talked about at all, as well as the pet welfare issue. And maybe those combined emphases together will help people to start shifting their behavior a bit more. So pet food is the biggest contributor. It has that huge global impact, but this is hugely variable depending on the type of food fed, and also, as I said, the way that the emissions are calculated. So again, it depends which paper you read, but emissions from a cat's probably a relatively conservative one. Overall is similar to driving, you know, a small car for a year, and from an average sort of 20 to 25 kilo dog, similar to driving a couple of 4x4s for a year. So it's quite impactful, and obviously that will depend on your annual mileage and et cetera, but you know, it's that sort of scale of impact, so it's not insignificant. And this slide has done something slightly funky, but it's just to say that we often think, and owners are often concerned about packaging being a big source of the impacts from their pet food because they can't recycle, for example, the pet pouches. But actually, there are other impacts that are far more when we consider pet food. So transportation is almost double the impact of packaging, and the ingredients is by far the biggest component of that. I think that other impacts, if it's fallen off your slide, was 2 or 3%. So, you know, packaging is not insignificant, but compared to things like the ingredients, it is not quite as important in terms of impacts. And what are the impacts? I mean, similar to our food, particularly related to meat consumption, it's around land use change, soil degradation, water use and contamination, and, you know, growing crops that are then fed to animals rather than people. I think the methane I put a star by because we know that that's a cycle, and actually ruminants get blamed a lot for methane and emissions, but actually it's not as bad as it might sound. And there's a lot of work that's been done not only in the profession but by Vet Sustain in particular around sort of helping get better messages around methane out there. But there's impacts from transportation and processing. And obviously, you know, the animals are involved, so it will have a degree of animal welfare impact. But just because we hear a lot of, especially on social media, a lot of sort of conversations around, oh, but we have to be feeding our pets, you know, lots of protein, lots of raw prime meat, you know, this is the best possible thing. Actually, you know, dogs are well evolved to eat grain-based diets, and there was a really good paper in Nature a few years ago that sort of went through all of the evidence of that, and that's backed up since then. We know also as vets that cats are obligate carnivores, so vegetarian and vegan diets can be much more challenging in these animals, maybe potentially a lot easier in dogs. On average, and again, looking at a lot of the studies, and they vary a lot, but I would say most studies would agree that wet food has about twice the impacts of dry food. So again, one piece of advice, if there's no contraindications for feeding, would be to feed your pet dry food. And like slightly terrifyingly, fresh and raw food and prime cuts and all of this sort of fads for more bougie type foods, they can have up to 47 times the impact of dry food. And again, this is some research that's being done currently in one of the UK universities, and it is really fascinating to hear some of the work that's being done on that. And I think it's also important to remember that animal byproducts that sometimes get a bad rep are actually very, very good. They're very nutritionally dense, and they have much lower impacts. And that's generally because of the way that they're calculated, but also because those prime cuts, if they're eaten by anyone, should probably be eaten by humans rather than being fed to pets. So that's just that Nature paper that talks about dogs' adaptations to starch-rich diets. And, you know, we have to remember that these animals are 30,000 years away from being wolves and really have quite well adapted to different diets. There's also a lot of talk about novel diets. So vegetarian and vegan food is increasingly popular. We've talked about the sort of caveats around cats. And there is some evidence, and there's more and more evidence coming out, which is really encouraging. And I think, you know, what's possibly lacking is lifelong controlled studies where we're looking at independent assessment of health rather than maybe owner perception of health of those animals. But I would say that if we can move towards diets that have a much higher percentage of plants, it's still okay, you know, potentially to have some meats, but that's the direction we want to go in because they will have much lower impacts. So a bit like with our own diets, you know, increasing the plant components, particularly of sustainable plant sources, will be very good for sustainability. There's a lot around insect protein, and it's more and more sustainable, particularly where the insects consume waste products. So it's a sort of recycling system. But I think we just need to be a little bit cautious, again, as the veterinary profession, around welfare and sentience. So there's increasing amounts of evidence around sentience. There's a free book that's downloadable called Edge of Sentience that's just been published this week by Jonathan Birch, the lead sort of philosopher and researcher at LSE, who's informing the government on sentience at the moment. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at that book too. But, you know, it's quite mind-boggling the amount of work that's being done on insect sentience. So I think that we just need to be mindful of that, considering the numbers involved, and also be mindful of how we can farm them in welfare-friendly ways. And then another really exciting area is cell cultured meat. Again, this is sort of meat grown in a lab. It's currently available for human consumption in a few countries, including America, Singapore, and Israel. And it's just been licensed for approval for pet food with one company in the UK, which is really exciting because that's the first pet food license globally. It will need wider uptake and ensuring they use renewable energy sources to make it truly sustainable, but that could be a really good option for pet food in the future. And just a note on treats. I mean, there's this increase in trends that pet food trends follow human fads and trends. So I think, you know, thinking about things like puppuccinos and doggy ice cream. I mean, just because you're having a treat doesn't necessarily mean your pet needs one, and just moving slightly away from anthropomorphizing that way could be helpful and helping our clients on that journey, not only for their health and obesity sake, but also, you know, it's probably unnecessary. And again, just something I became aware of recently, there's other risks from things like feeding wild game that I wasn't aware of, you know, really high levels of lead in some shot animals. And we're trying to work on banning lead shot in the environment just for wildlife in general, but it could also be affecting our pets. So just to be aware of that one too. So take home points on diets. I mean, be aware of these fads and trends, try and educate people against feeding human food, making sure they're aware of toxicities, you know, maybe having waiting room posters around that sort of thing. The biggest one is not overfeeding. You know, if we can reduce obesity, brilliant for sustainability, brilliant for pet welfare. It will save people money. It's really quite crazy that it's got so out of control. Choosing nutritionally complete food with high proportion of sustainable plant ingredients that will help. Avoid excessive protein. A lot of these foods are marketed as high protein, but if you actually look at the protein needs of dogs and cats, it's much lower than some of the protein included in some of the diets. And trying to opt for dry over wet if you can. If you're feeding a carnivore, really look and see if you can consider high animal welfare brands as well. So we're not only considering pet welfare, but also the welfare of the animals that go into the food. And avoid raw. I mean, we know the risks around raw in general, home cooked diets as well. And think about those novel diets too. So again, hot off the press, BVA's just launched their policy position on diet choices. It's freely accessible for all. And there's a big document behind that with loads more info, which is the working group document. And if you're a BVA member, you can also download that working group document. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that too, but everyone can get this policy position. So check that out too. Okay, medicines and parasiticides. We've recently done a whole other webinar on this, so I'm going to whiz through this section, but I would encourage you to have a look at that if you're interested in this. There's quite a lot of work that's been done, including the BVA's policy position on parasiticides in cats and dogs. But we're seeing particularly things like fipronil and imidacloprid showing up in rivers in the UK. The products are banned in agricultural use, and while they are available in some other household products, probably the main source is from pet topical spot-on flea treatments. So I think we need to be mindful of that and really be mindful of the potential impacts around all of this and you know, really lead the way on looking at how we can not only prescribe and dispense these products related to risk, but have these conversations with clients about, you know, what is the overall risk for the pet versus the overall planetary risk. So again, there's been quite a lot published around this. I think the worry with some of these compounds is that they're potentially toxic to not only invertebrates and insects, but also birds and potentially other vertebrates. So I think we need to be very, very mindful of how we use these products now that we have at least some evidence. And this is just a paper again talking about the toxicity in birds and fish as well. And I think it's important when we talk about parasiticides to remember that all drugs must end up somewhere. So, you know, we're actually seeing impacts from human, recreational and prescription drugs popping up in the environment. I mean, it's sort of funny in some ways, but it's also really worrying. You know, there's animals downstream from Glastonbury that are, you know, high on the drugs from cocaine. I saw a paper the other day about sharks having a lot of cocaine in their tissues off the coast of Mexico and around there. And it's like really worrying. And so I think it's not just parasiticides that will end up in the environment, but potentially anything that we can use. You know, there's a study that shows that birds are probably being exposed to Prozac and then they're not breeding because they're so sort of chilled out. So it's fascinating, but also terrifying. And again, there's growing evidence of concerns, particularly around the route that these products might enter the environment. So one of the sort of seminal papers on this work was published by Rose Perkins a few years ago, which led to the BVA working on this and developing the policy position. But more recently, there's been a paper that shows actually it could be as much as washing your pet's bedding or petting your pet and then washing your hands. And that's also a route for these products to get into the environment. So we just have to be really mindful and think about ways that we can reduce these products getting into the environment and really think, while animal welfare of our pets is really important and preventative health is really important, we need a functional ecosystem to sustain the pets of the future. And we have a responsibility to those pets as well. So not only should we be maybe thinking about what products we're using, but also if we are using topical spot-ons, you know, making sure that our pets don't go swimming immediately afterwards. I mean, it also won't be efficacious. Making sure they don't go to the groomers and trying to get these messages out there. And I know that this is more than you can fit in a 10 or 15-minute consult. So maybe we need to have parasite consults as part of our, you know, bigger picture preventative health stuff. And this is that new paper by Rose Perkins and others around how these products may get into the environment as well. So I think working with clients together to prevent and check for parasites in that risk-based way is really important. There's a lot of detail about this in both the BVA's policy position and the other webinar, understanding the risk to pets, but also people, there are some zoonotic risks, which we see from pet parasites that maybe not so much of an issue in things like farm and equine parasites, but also these risks to the planet. And I think, you know, maybe we really need to think not only about potential issues around things like zoonotic disease and resistance and issues for the planet, but also how we can be more at peace maybe with overall using less of these drugs and medicines in general in pets. And I think taking that risk-based approach, it's really useful to remember what we've done with antibiotics, because I think there was a time when we would be very scared not to give an animal an antibiotic when we're doing surgery. And now, because of the pressure from AMR and the bigger picture sort of One Health impacts of that, you know, we've really moved completely in the other direction. And you know, most of the time it is okay for those pets. So ensuring that appropriate use, recording and monitoring use is really important, and remembering that big One Health element. So we do need to think about human health and, you know, potential zoonotic disease, particularly if there's immunocompromised people. But I think we just can't forget about the planet, because that will affect all of us, and maybe not in our generation or our pets' generation, but for sure for those of the future. And then that's just a shout out to the RCVS Knowledge Hub, you know, look at what they've done around AMR, rethink what we're doing. I think, you know, we are quite scared about not treating animals for parasites prophylactically, preventatively, but we can maybe start to shift the thinking on that. And we know this is really tricky because we've been telling clients to give preventative, you know, monthly treatments for a long time. Often they're tied to health plans. So there's that client bonding and practice income element, which we'll come on to talk about. I think a huge issue is a lot of these products are available over the counter. We don't actually know if the other alternatives are indeed better for the environment. I mean, there's an assumption there, and hopefully they will be, but we really don't know. And I think, you know, it takes time to talk through this. It takes time to think about the individual risk to the pet. But we do need to balance that individual patient welfare with the bigger picture, and be mindful of the moral stress it puts on us. You know, if we're not treating an animal and then it does go and get an infection, how are we going to deal with that? And how can we come together as a practice team to support each other through talking about those sorts of scenarios? So these are just, again, some QR codes to some of the resources on this. Have a look at the BVA's policy position. There's also a toolkit. There's these posters that you can print out, both for clients and for you, as a bit like the AMR antibiotics 5-point plan. There's a parasiticide one. And then there's the Vet Sustain and BVA webinar series. And if you go to the Vet Sustain website, there's also our last webinar a couple of months ago. We talked completely about parasiticides. So if you're interested, have a listen to that. We can go into a lot more depth then. And I think, you know, being mindful that this and all of this that we're talking about tonight, it is tricky. You know, it is hard when there's not a lot of evidence, but having the time to discuss with your teams, with your clients, restructuring health plans, looking at how we can do that individualized care, and thinking about what products we have on the shelf, it is important too. So pet poo is our next subject of the carbon paw print. I think, again, a massive, easy take-home message I can give that we can feed on to clients is to pick up the pet's poo. And I know, again, that message has come through loud and clear for things like human health and safety and zoonotic disease risk, but actually it has a massive impact in terms of the environment. So even if you're out in the middle of nowhere walking your dog and it poos, it's still better to pick up that poo and take it home than it is to leave it in the environment. And I would probably think that it's still better to do that even if you have a plastic poo bag rather than a biodegradable one, because the impacts from leaving poo in the environment are quite substantial in terms of the sort of nutrient runoff and the local effects. We know it's got the zoonotic disease risk as well. It's got parasite contamination risk, not just for other pets, but also for part of the farm animal parasite life cycles too. So being mindful of this, helping to remind clients that this is really important and it's a good way to reduce carbon paw print is important too. The next subject is all of this stuff that we get for our pets. You know, this could be plastic things, toys, bedding, clothing. Lots of these end up in landfill. Lots of these we buy so that we feel better or because we have this sort of consumer attitude in life now. We as vets and vet nurses know that some of these can be unsafe for pets. So all round it's sort of helping to get those educational messages out there. Lots of these can be quite hard to recycle. And I think, you know, when we're thinking about this, it's important to remember what are we selling and promoting in our practice on the shelves too. So maybe rethinking what you're selling in-house is a good way to talk about this. And, you know, you could have some different options or more sustainable options. But really, in general, just getting away from thinking that our pets need loads of stuff is probably a good place to start. And I really like this meme. It might be a bit too small for you to read, but it says at the top, the wolf is saying, "I'm cold and hungry. I see humans around a bonfire. Maybe I can ask for food. What could possibly go wrong?" And then 30,000 years later, we've got the bracky dog dressed up, not looking very happy at all, in his crocheted hat. But I think, you know, really trying to rethink from the pet's perspective, you know, we can really be advocates for animals. We can help people to understand their welfare. Our pets don't want loads of Instagram likes. They don't want the costume where they can't wag their tail. You know, they want to be played with or to go for a run in the park or to have a day spent with you or just maybe a cardboard box if they're a cat. You know, they can have hours of fun with things like that. And then you can reuse it for something else. So really, we want to turn this anthropomorphizing that so many people are putting on their pets to more of an empathetic, you know, recognition of their sentience and really helping them understand the pet's needs. And I think, again, that will have a big impact on the carbon paw print and sustainability side. In terms of diseases, we know that many emerging infectious diseases are from animals, especially wildlife. And I think there possibly is increased pet and wildlife contact, maybe in urban areas. We're seeing a lot of wildlife come in to urban areas these days. And I think, you know, we just need to be mindful of some future risks. You know, pandemics could show up. They might be zoonotic. They could infect our pets. You know, there could be crossover between livestock and pets. I think we just need to bear this in mind in our professions and just be maybe aware of these sorts of risks and think about strategically, you know, how could we tackle them in the future. But again, if there was a big risk in terms of disease, that would have a degree of impact on the carbon paw print. And a lot of this is unknown and hopefully won't happen for a long time. But I think we just need to be mindful of it. We've seen AI in cats and COVID and all sorts of things in our domestic pets. So these sorts of things are not impossible. And we know food risks, especially raw feeding, has the risk not only to our pets, but also to the owners handling that food too. And we'll touch on biodiversity impacts. So in some countries, cats are now banned from going outside, or they have curfews where they're only allowed out at certain hours. And, you know, that's probably something that we don't want to go down that route in this country because of the impacts on cat welfare. But, you know, they do have a big impact on wildlife predation. And I think we really have a responsibility to help educate clients as to how we can reduce that, so that we're not in a position where all of our cats are locked inside, suffering themselves. And there's a really good paper out a year or so ago around how if you play with your cat just for a few minutes a day in a particular way of play, so that sort of predation type behavior play, that can significantly reduce the number of animals predated in the wild. We can also use strategies such as sort of timed cat flaps, where they can't go out at dusk and dawn when they might be hunting the most. So using these sorts of strategies is important. And I think, again, for dog walkers, dog disturbance of wildlife can be significant. I think keeping to footpaths, keeping your dogs on a lead where appropriate and where the signs say that is really important, and reminding people that these messages are there for a reason. They can cause a lot of stress in wildlife, nest disturbance, that sort of thing. So we need to be mindful of these impacts too, because they are pretty significant when you add them up. And I think just sort of a shout out of us all doing better around what to do with injured wildlife and how to communicate that with clients. So if you do find wildlife that was caught by a cat or something like that, you know, making sure you're educated as vet as to how to triage it, you know, whether it's appropriate for rehabilitation and re-release, working with a good rehabber locally, or whether you need to euthanize it. And part of my new job at RSPCA is to provide a whole load of resources to help you do that, because I appreciate we don't get taught a lot about that. So watch this space for that as well. And then just sort of coming to the end of the impacts, I mean, practice impacts. This is a little bit less to do with conversations with your clients, but I think this is, again, a significant part of the carbon paw print. And we need to think about impacts from anaesthetics, which is vast. Also things like consumables, energy, vehicles, commuting, and waste. And there's some really good resources. There's a whole webinar series, and I point you all in the direction of the Greener Veterinary Practice Checklist to have a look at this. Again, check out that QR code. Have a look at that in more detail, because again, we go through all of those impacts in much more detail during that webinar series. And then just to finish on practice health plans, as I've said, you know, a lot of these are currently linked to, you know, maybe some routine examinations, maybe vaccinations, and a lot around preventative prophylactic parasiticides. But maybe we can rethink that. Maybe we can restructure it so that rather than getting medicines, they get a preventative health consult, they get a dental health consult, a weight management consult, that sort of parasite tailored plan, something around nutrition and exploring some of these potentially novel diets and what would be appropriate for that pet. And talking about behavior, again, we talk a little bit about behavior when they're very little, but there's not much after that. And if we can nip some of those behavioral issues in the bud early on, regardless of the age of the animal, you know, that could be massively beneficial for their welfare. And if they're thinking of breeding or neutering their animal, again, you could have a whole consult on that. And, you know, nurses were brilliant at a lot of these too. And I think we'll see clients demanding that sustainable approach. So we really need to embrace this way of thinking. And there's no reason that clients wouldn't pay money for this sort of expert advice and help tailored to their individual pet. I think really that's the direction we have to rethink things. So I'm now going to hand over to Colin to talk to us about the animal care side of things. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Justine. Really fascinating, interesting I've learned a lot this evening from that hour. That was an hour, time well spent this evening, I think, because certainly I had a lot of things that came through that I've learned things from. So thank you for that really interesting talk, Justine. I'm just going to take a very few slides, and then we have got time for questions. Just noticed somebody who'd like to ask some questions. Really just to hopefully give people a little peek into what I know is often a black box of the pharmaceutical industry and what we are doing, and certainly with a focus on animal care, to try and join in with the sustainability effort. Could move to the next slide, please. So in joining industry, what we don't have to do, like there are lots of vets working in the veterinary pharmaceutical industry, and it's not a requirement that we have to drop our interests in animal welfare and in animals as we enter. In many ways, the things and the impacts that we can have within the pharmaceutical industry can have impacts on a wide range of animals, indirectly through the work that we do with veterinary practices, but also in the decisions that are made internally within the veterinary sector, veterinary pharmaceutical industry as well. So we do have a real interest in sustainability, and that comes from two roots really. Just generally because we are humans also and part of the planet, and we want to join in the sustainability effort. But also there is a very strong impetus and an idea that having healthy animals has a lesser impact on the environment and is a more sustainable way of owning pets. And so the contributions that we can make to helping maintain animal health are really important, we feel. Can we go on to the next slide? So one of the ways that we do that is by partnering with other organisations. So if anybody isn't aware of Rumour CA&E, I would strongly encourage you to look at their report, and they're doing really, starting off really at looking at some very good work in trying to estimate the antimicrobial use in companion animal and equine medicine in the UK, and strategies to reduce that whilst maintaining appropriate use. Rumour has a very good reputation for doing that same work in farm animal practice, and now they're moving over to companion animal and equine side to see if they can also, by informing the profession about how we're actually using antimicrobials, to make sure that we join in the effort of using them responsibly and effectively towards animal health. Another organisation that we are part of is NOAA, so National Office of Animal Health, and that you may have come across by being the source of the compendium. So lots of product details are present in the compendium, but NOAA also sponsors a range of practical surveys and all sorts of things. So well worthwhile, again, a website to sort of look at occasionally. One thing I'm very proud and again encourage you to look at is this Pause to Protect campaign, which is all about getting pet owners to read the information leaflets, and that chimes in with what Justine was saying about use of parasiticides, because a lot of those details of what you should and shouldn't do in relation to use of a product are contained within the patient information leaflet, and encouraging pet owners to use medicines in the right way, in the way that they're intended, and disposing of the packaging in the appropriate way as well, is all part of that impetus. So just getting owners to use medicines in the way that we would like them and they were intended to be used can be a strong force to making sure that that packaging doesn't end up somewhere where it shouldn't, or that the medicines are used inappropriately. Next slide, please. Another aspect of that, and another partnership that we have, is with Veterinary Osteoarthritis Alliance, and this comes into the factors of chronic disease. And veterinary practices, I suppose traditionally we've concentrated on acute treatments and acute disease, But certainly the information from human healthcare is that animals and people with long-term conditions, if they are not well controlled, can have a much bigger impact in terms of numbers of visits required to vets and amount of medication that they need over their lifetime. And that includes things like number of anesthetics that perhaps they use for a variety of conditions. Osteoarthritis is a very common disease, so 1 in 20 of dogs over a year of age could have signs of osteoarthritis. So, you know, having the best opportunity to manage that condition and to manage it appropriately certainly can make sure that those animals stay well and are able to sustain a healthy lifestyle into the future, including things like maintaining an appropriate body weight. My last slide is just really focused on the pharmaceutical industry. So we probably get quite a bad rep because we're a manufacturing industry and a true industry, but we do actually take quite a lot of strides and give thought to sustainability. So in the drug development and drug creation side of things, we do try to encourage short supply chains. So that means we're trying not to rely on shipments of products across vast distances on ships. Certainly for animal care, a lot of our supply chains are within Europe, and we do try to use sustainable vehicles, so electric vehicles for deliveries and traveling around wherever we can. We do vet companies that we work with. We try to moderate our commuting and business travel as much as possible. And although we haven't quite managed to move over to electric vehicles yet, it is something that's very constantly on our radar, even for our representatives that you see day in, day out in veterinary practices. So we do really work very hard internally and externally. The packaging that a lot of products come in is subject to a great deal of legislation. So I know there are frustrations sometimes with types of packaging that medicines are provided in, but a lot of that is down to the legislation that we have to abide by. Some packaging is obviously very readily recycled, like cardboard boxes and package inserts, but a lot of the plastics we're still reliant on, but there are significant efforts in human and veterinary healthcare to try and move away from that as fast as we can. And certainly some of the plastics that we are looking at for packaging medicines are moving. It's a slow movement, but they are moving slowly. Okay, that was my little bit on the industry side. So I think over to questions, which it looks as though you've got quite a few.
Super. Thank you. Thank both of you. That was it's really brilliant to hear about some of the initiatives going on within animal care and that you're involved in more widely to support sustainable and responsible pet care. And Justine, thank you so much. As you said, the comparison at the beginning to aviation and pet care is really quite mind-blowing. So really important that we think about some of these things. I've had a few questions come through. I think we've got time to make our way through some of them. What is the big difference between pet poo? So this is about picking up pet poo versus other animal feces that remain nutrients in the soil and go back into the soil?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I would have to confess that I'm not a poo expert yet. I mean, I've been reading a little bit about it, but again, knowing that pet poo has such a big impact, it did make me think, you know, along very similar lines. And I think it's probably fair to say that industrial farming, effluent feces, waste, etc., has a massive impact on the environment too. And I mean, I think one of the biggest elements of the sort of carbon and sustainability impacts related to agriculture is to do with waste and water pollution and contamination. So I think it is significant. I'm not sure there's really any difference there. It's just that you know, it's part of that you know, industry that has that processes and you know, probably they should be doing something around that, and there's probably all sorts of schemes and sort of recycling, etc., that's done. I just don't know enough about it to properly answer, but really good question, and it's probably worth us all yeah, trying to do a bit more reading on that too.
Super, thank you. So a question on diets. How do we build trust with clients around diets? often it can be seen as selling. How can we build some more trust around these conversations?
Yeah, I think again, I mean, a lot of these things where we're trying to get clients to change behaviors or rethink the things or get information from us rather than from social media, I think a lot of that requires time and sort of strategy, I suppose. And we know that the profession is under a massive sort of time pressure at the moment, probably more than ever. And I think, you know, maybe just if you're really keen to get involved and support sustainability, and I think, you know, I need to take my own advice and do this more, is, you know, talking about it maybe in our own networks, to our own friends, to people that we know that have animals, you know, maybe trying some of these diets on our own pets. I don't have a pet, sadly, but I do sort of adopt my mum's dog in the sort of model I was talking about earlier. And, you know, we gave him some vegetarian treats the other day and he absolutely went mad for them, you know. And so I think we have these assumptions that maybe our pets wouldn't like a certain diet, or maybe it's not good for them. And I think we all need to educate ourselves better. I think there's a lot of work to be done around sort of veterinary education, so we feel more empowered and equipped to have those conversations with clients so that they then can trust us. Because I think it's hard when we as vets and vet nurses maybe don't have all of the information to be able to really sort of talk to clients about that. But I think, again, making sure that clients have choice. So like with anything around the care of their animal, you know, with a veterinary interaction, you want to be presenting them with options and then sort of leading them through the choice. But it's really their choice. So I think hopefully that would take away the sales pitch element of it. But yeah, I'd welcome any other thoughts on that, because again, I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I think some of these conversations are going to be ongoing conversations. It's not a one conversation and we've ticked that off. This is really building over time, and the conversation will grow and develop. Sort of related, slightly long question. So how do you make sure recommendations aren't just greenwashing, actually addressing parts of the impact? And there can be some messaging around different motivations and stores, suppliers and things. How do we really ensure that we're not greenwashing?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably focusing on the impacts that we know are going to benefit animal welfare and sustainability and save clients money. It's hard to say that anything would be just greenwashing when you know, there's so many combined benefits. And, you know, really thinking about the easy win. So in practice, thinking about things like anesthetic use, you know, has a massive impact, and there's quite good published evidence on how we can reduce that, you know, pretty much overnight. And I think, again, with pet feeding, if we can at least address, you know, the overfeeding and obesity issue, I mean, that's no matter what food you're feeding, that's going to be way more sustainable. So I think, you know, focusing on what we know and we've got evidence on and we can change is much better than maybe getting too bogged down in, you know, the complexities and nuance of things like, you know, the parasiticides debate, which, you know, we don't have all the answers for, and we can talk about it for a long time and we really still don't know exactly the right way forward. We've got some ideas, but, you know, there are things that we know for sure. So I think focusing on that hopefully will seem a bit less like greenwashing, and you know, really being mindful, doing a carbon calculator. Vet Sustain's got a great carbon calculator. If you check out our website, you can have a look there, but looking at what your impacts as a practice actually are, you know, and while everything's better than nothing, there are some things you could probably do that would not make much of a difference, and there's other things that probably make a massive difference. So again, just being mindful of looking at our own operations as well.
Super, thanks. That's really helpful. Like you say, I think there's so much nuance around that we can sometimes worry about greenwashing of different aspects where we don't have all of the information, but knowing, sort of starting with the information we do have is really important. If there's any other questions, I've got a couple others. Do please send them to me or pop them in the chat. Back on poo and poo bags. So this is a hot topic and can be quite confusing, but recommendations around sort of biodegradable, which, you know, may not be biodegradable, and your thoughts on sort of the best poo bags to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biodegradable ones, they are biodegradable under the right circumstances, but most of the places that poo bags will end up are not the right circumstances. So I think we need to be mindful of that. I mean, a lot of poo that goes into the sort of doggy poo bin type setups in public areas, I believe, is incinerated as well. So again, that will really, it's not going to biodegrade because it's going to burn. It may or may not burn greener. You know, I don't know enough about it, but I think that, again, picking up the poo and you know, reusing bags. We all have a lot of plastic bags around, you know, bread bags or other bags that food comes in. You know, we don't need to buy extra plastic just for poo bags, you know, and so a bit of like strategic recycling, particularly for bags that we can't put in the, you know, big supermarket recycling things, so that we're being a bit more sustainable that way. Things like that are probably better, or picking it up in a, you know, a bit of newspaper, as gross as that might seem, you know, this is not too sloppy, you know, stuff like that. So yeah, maybe just not getting too focused on what they're actually made of, but being a bit more mindful of recycling, that kind of thing, probably better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is often that what we've already got is the lowest impact, and then working from there. Super. I am very conscious of the time. There was one more question that's a quick one, which was, what was the book that you recommended on sentience? You mentioned
that's called The Edge of Sentience by Jonathan Birch. And if you Google it now, it's that you'll somehow find it. I don't know the exact link, but there's a free PDF download. You can also order it to buy as an actual book. But I think it would be fascinating. It's only just come out. I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to read it. And also AWF had a whole stream on insect sentience in this year's conference. That's available on AWF's website. Amazing speakers, including that speaker, and also this brilliant woman called Megan from the States, who was like mind-blowing on. I learned so much about insects. So if you're interested in that, check out AWF's website too.
super. Wonderful. That was absolutely brilliant. If you want any more information about Let's Sustain or our courses, please feel free to check out our website, check out our courses online. We are a community interest company and not for profit. So if you wanted to donate to Vet Sustain and support our work, you can also do that via the QR code there. Finally, a huge thank you to Justine for your brilliant talk, and for Colin and Animal Care for supporting this webinar tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us on a particularly warm Tuesday evening. It's been brilliant to have you all with us, and we hope to see you again really soon.